Hi guys, this is SDJRSNF88 speaking with the first update on a new and exciting project. Now, this is something I've really wanted to do for quite a while now, and I finally decided to get started on it. And as you guessed from the title, is of course the building of a World War I narrow gauge trench railway. So, without further ado, let's get into the first update. So, why a narrow gauge trench railway? Now, the main reason is it is a combination of two of my passions, which is of course railways and military history. And I thought this project would combine the two neatly together. Another reason is there's been a recent resurgence in WW1. Now, this is going to be the scale of the layout, which WW1 is basically the narrow gauge equivalent to 00 scale. So you could put WW1 on a 00 gauge railway, and basically it would represent a narrow gauge railway system to 00 scale. And this is something I've always wanted to model, and in recent years with the resurgence of mini trains and of course Batman bringing out new products as well as Helljam, WW1 is really coming back, especially in ready to run form. And there's been a huge burst of World War I themed locomotives and rolling stock. Of course, there's plenty of kits to build as well. As a friend has said to me before, you're not a proper WW1 modeler until you actually build some of the rolling stock yourself, which of course I do plan to do at a later date. And yeah, so there's been a resurgence in models which are related to the World War I theme. But as well as that, I was really inspired by my recent visit, well, a couple of months back, to the last ever narrow gauge Southwest show, and it really was a shame that the show has come to an end, but I could totally see why they'd done it. But there was over 70 layouts there. I was blown away by the variety and the detail of these layouts and what could be done with narrow gauge. Now, of course, not all of them were WW1, but the majority were, and it really was inspirational to see so many modelers modelling this scale and the detail that you could put into it. And yeah, basically spurred on by this and some of the size of the layouts as well, it really is amazing. There were some really large layouts and of course some really small ones, which of course gave me the idea for this layout. Now, as you know, my recent or the previous layout to this is Compton Quay, which is my main exhibition layout, which is a micro layout. And that is based on an ironing board, and although it is very fun at shows, it is basically just a short back and forth, and really I've wanted an exhibition layout that I could sort of leave running, and a continuous loop basically, so there's always something moving. So if I'm not doing shunting or anything, I could just leave a train just to run around for a bit, and you basically there's always something moving on the layout basically. And WW1, because of its size, sort of sets itself for that. So that is one key feature which will be featured on this layout. So what you're looking at here is the starter pieces for the project. We have the baseboards, which are MDF, I believe. Basically, they are 2 foot by 4 foot and quite light. So that is going to be the size of the layout. There's another sheet underneath there that will be used for the sides, the ends, and of course the back seam, which will be split through the middle. Now, I have got a plan which we will take a look at in a second in a bit more detail. Now, to strengthen the this board, I've got some plywood battens which are behind me at the moment, and basically they will go around the base of this board and to give it a bit more, make it more rigid and easy to transport. So I've got a little plan here, so we're going to take a closer look and basically explain some of the sort of the detail of the layouts, what I plan to include, and of course the history behind it and where the layout is going to be set. So without further ado, let's take a look at the plans. So here are my plans for the railway. This is just a quick rough sketch, nothing to scale, but it will hopefully give you guys an idea on what I hope the railway to look like when it's complete. So as you can see, we've got the 4 foot by 2 foot baseboard, and we've got a continuous loop with a fiddle yard. Then we've got a back seam split right down the middle there, and then we've got the scenery side, which has a passing loop and a siding. Now, this area is going to depict a sort of a field HQ or artillery battery. As you can see, we've got the artillery gun there, and I have got an artillery gun which will go in place on there, which has featured previously on my channel on the back of my World War II freight train, which is one of my first videos, but I'm hoping to make good use of that gun on this layout. So what basically happens is the railway comes through this sort of derelict farmyard, across a road, and then into this passing loop here where there's basically a little makeshift halt that's been made up, just basically using old timbers and bits of old trench that have just been chucked down in the mud. And basically this is where soldiers will get on and off the trains, and as you can see they also unload artillery shells for the artillery battery just here, as well as shells and other things for the tanks that are being serviced in this area. Now there's also siding here where wagons could be stored and other things, and then we've also got a trench here as well, which of course is very iconic for World War One, where basically soldiers would be waiting for the next offensive to head off down and defending these trenches here. And now this area is going to be the sort of the depiction of a bit of no man's land. You can see here we've got a barbed wire strip that runs basically parallel with the back scene, which I hope to recreate. Now the railway basically then continues off into a trench of its own. This will be quite a wide trench with foot soldiers in there as well. There are pictures of trenches, wide trenches, where the railway actually did run down a trench, which was also serviced by soldiers as well. So soldiers would also be defending this and using this to get to the front line, as well as the trains. And this is something I hope to depict here. And it'll basically run off through the back scene and into the fiddle yard there. Now, when I originally came up with the idea for this railway, I really didn't have an idea on where to set this, whether it would be correct for anything. It was just going to be a fictitious trench scene somewhere in war-torn Europe. But I decided to do a bit of research, and I've really narrowed it down, and I've picked the perfect sort of location where this layout could potentially be set, and even the period. So I've decided that this area will depict part of the Battle of Amiens, which, I hope I pronounced that right, which was a major battle and a major turning point during World War One. Amiens was basically a city, with a large rail hub, and in the spring of 1918, the Germans made a massive offensive to try and capture the city from the Allies. In doing so, they captured a load of trenches, and this trench would have been one of the ones that was captured. In the process, a number of British tanks and other bits of armour, as well as the narrow gauge rolling stock, would have been captured, as well as the Germans moving in their own armour and narrow gauge rolling stock as well. Now, in the summer of 1918, August, began the Allied offensive with the Americans along with the British and other Allied forces, and basically they pushed back the Germans, recapturing most of the land that the Germans had captured, including this trench, which is what this railway will depict once the Allies had recaptured and recreated this stronghold. Now, as you can see, Allied tanks would have moved back in, along with captured German armour, which would have been left as sort of scuttled there. This did happen during the battle. In some cases, a whole narrow gauge network was captured by the Germans from the British, but then recaptured again. And in doing so, a load of German narrow gauge locomotives and other items of rolling stock were recaptured and then used by the Allies. And that gives me plenty of scope for this railway, which means I could have British, American narrow gauge locomotives, and even captured German locomotives and rolling stock being used on the railway, which gives this railway a real wide scope. Not only that, the Battle of Amiens was also a real turning point during the war as well, as in the fact that it went from trench warfare to what we now classify as the first mechanised warfare, where there was the first historical points of tank-on-tank battles, which is why there is plenty of armour here. Now, during the British and the Allied offensive, 580 tanks were used during this offensive from August to November, and of course the treaty was then signed not long after that. And this is something which I hope to depict here, so we'll have plenty of Allied armour waiting to be moved onto the front line, being prepared, being refuelled, being re-armoured, and basically that is something I really want to create, and it's a combination of both, as I've mentioned, both of my interests. So I've really enjoyed looking into this, and I look forward to looking into more of the history of the battle, but this is what I aim for the railway to sort of depict, and I hope you guys will enjoy the sort of theme of that. So without further ado, let's take a look at some of the items I've purchased to get ready to start on this project. So I thought a good place to start would of course be track work, and as you can see I've purchased a fair bit. Now this is all Pico WW1 set track. Now there's a number of reasons why I've opted to use the set track range. First of all, the radius of the curves. The radius is a set minimum radius which the majority of WW1 rolling stock can get around, which is good and will hopefully fit on the 2 foot by 4 foot board. Another reason is the point work. Now as you can see here, this is a standard set track point, and the good thing about these are isolated. I noticed that the streamline track is not isolated, which would mean there'd be a lot of extra wiring and other bits and pieces, a bit like the trouble I've had with my garden railway recently. So I've decided to opt for that. Another reason is the fact that it really is sort of set track itself. I mean, these particular sort of straights here are very similar to the set track that they used actually in the trenches, with prefabbed sections of rail, which they simply just was all fabricated, sleepers and rails, and they just simply lifted it to the front line, placed it down, bolted it together, and then moved on to the next section. So really the set track does lend itself to recreating that sort of track work. I've also purchased one of the major structures that will be on the layout, and it's this lovely Airfix resin building which is of a European ruined workshop, and this will become part of the little farm scene which the narrow gauge railway will run through. And as you can see from the top there, it needs painting, and I hope to paint it in sort of a colour scheme to buildings that would have been related in that area. And of course I'm going to try and practice my my skills on painting brickwork. So I'm looking forward to having a go at painting this building, and hopefully setting into a lovely little farm scene or derelict farm scene on the layout in the not too distant future. Now these I'm really pleased with. These are in fact posts and barbed wire, and I picked these up from Signals Models of Midsomer Norton, and basically you just stretch this out and you place them between the posts like I've done with this one here. Now this will be stretched out a lot more when I finally put them together, but this basically recreates quite a dominant feature of World War I landscape, which was of course barbed wire traps, and this will feature heavily as part of the back scene. And I'm really pleased that it's made in scale model form, and these are in fact 00 gauge, which I'm really pleased with. And once these are stretched out and obviously made a bit smaller sort of thing, I think it will really blend in well with the war-torn landscape. And here we have a lovely selection of minifigures. This is World War I medical staff and soldiers, as made by Batman. As you can see, there's some nice sort of posed soldier figures in here, and also some injured soldiers as well as a couple of nurses. Now I'm not sure about the nurses being on the front line, but if you have any information about that, please do let me know. But the soldiers at least will fit in very well on the layout, and I do plan to get a few more of these, and also some Airfix soldiers as well as cavalry, which I plan to paint up and have a go at painting and fitting in the scenes as well. I've also started getting a few of the scenic items for the railway. The first is these lovely little long grass tufts, which I will add around the edge of the buildings, the trenches, and in the muddy boggy areas and other bits and pieces. They're just the right sort of colour, I feel. They look quite muddy and dirty, so I think they'll blend in with the landscape quite well. I've also got these. Now these I'm very pleased with, as they look to me very much like poppies, and as you know, poppies are iconic with World War I. As you know, they are the symbol of remembrance, and it just makes perfect sense to include them in on the railway. And I apologise for the colour doesn't quite show up very well on the camera, but they really do look the part, and I look forward to adding these around the edge of the battlefield. As mentioned, I plan to feature plenty of armour on the layout, so I thought a good starting point would be this, which is an Airfix Mel Mark I tank. Now the Mark I was fairly outdated by 1918, which is when I plan to set this layout, but with a bit of modification I feel I can make it look like a sort of a later version of the tank. Now the main tank that took place during this battle was the Mark V, and I hope to get a model of that in the not too distant future. But for now, I feel this Mark I tank will do. Basically, it'll be a good way of getting back into building Airfix kits, something I've really enjoyed in the past, and with a bit of modification I feel it'll fit in quite well. And here we have the first few items of rolling stock for the railway, including this stunning Mini Trains Baldwin 262. Now, this is my first WW1 locomotive, and the first thing that really hit me was the size of this thing. It really is tiny, but it's still crammed full of detail, including that little headlight on the front there, which actually does operate. Now, one interesting feature, is sort of a sort of double-sided sword really, is the motor. Now, the motor is located in the cab, which means there is no cab detail, but one bonus feature for this, it is a rather large motor for the model and is fitted with a brass flywheel, which will provide smooth and powerful running, which is very important for WW9 models. Now, these locomotives were widely used with the US Army, and there is some great archive footage online of these locomotives in action in the trenches, and it really was inspirational as to what these locomotives did, and of course giving me ideas as to what they actually hauled and the sort of loads that were on the wagons behind them. And I've used sort of snapshots from this that video to sort of inspire me as to modifying the wagons and adding the loads, which we'll of course take a look at now. And here we have the first wagon, which is a small stake wagon. Now, I've got two of these, and I plan to get a few more, and these wagons are widely featured in that video which I've just previously mentioned. And some of the loads these things carried, they carried all manner of things, from ammunition, weapons, supply crates, aid, and even soldiers. There was a great shot of a train of these rushing to the front line, with soldiers standing on the back, and they were holding onto the metal stakes, which are supplied in the box. I haven't got around to fitting them yet. And there must have been at least 20 soldiers crammed onto the back of this little wagon, holding onto each other's shoulders so they didn't fall off. And yeah, so I plan to recreate that in model form with these wagons. And here we have the final item of rolling stock for the moment, which is, of course, this lovely little open car, again made by Mini Trains. Like the state car, they carried many resources to and from the front line, including soldiers, aid, etc. But one of the most common items these wagons carried, or what I've seen in a lot of pictures, is artillery shells. Now, this is something I would love to recreate with this wagon, with it carrying a number of artillery shells, especially considering that I plan to have an artillery battery actually on the layout, so it would make perfect sense to have shells in the back of this wagon. So I'm going to create a few little shells from scratch and basically fit them into the back of this wagon, which will hopefully recreate this sort of movement. Now, the wagons are a bit bright, I must admit, at the moment, so I am going to plan to weather these down at a later date. Of course, being a war setting, they wouldn't have lasted in a clean look for very long. Probably not even a couple of hours. But yes, I'm going to plan to sort of figure out what's the best weathering technique for these. Again, they are very fine, so I don't want to hamper the running gear by getting paint in there or any other thing. So I'm going to have to try and think long and hard about getting the right sort of effect on these wagons. But yes, that's all the rolling stock for a moment. I'm sure there'll be plenty of more items of rolling stock joining this layout in the not too distant future. So that's all for this update. I hope to bring you more progress on the layout as it continues. Now, I don't plan to rush this project. As you know, I sort of jinxed it with the GWR 2600 project, which I started, well, it's coming up to nearly 3 years this year ago, and I said that it was as a quick project, and of course it still isn't complete. But with this layout, I plan to take my time with it. Of course, experimenting with techniques like what I did on Compton Martin, which quite a few of you mentioned, and what you guys really enjoyed about that update, which is really, really nice to hear. So I plan to do that with this layout. And yeah, so I've got quite a lot to get on with. Of course, it's going to be the building of the tank, paint of the building, and then of course, basically the main thing that really needs to get done is basically the building of the baseboard. Once the baseboard has been constructed, I could then start laying and test laying track and seeing what room I have for the fiddle yard, the passing loop and the siding and other things before I could start setting in all the little trenches and the sort of the raised areas and other things. So I hope you enjoyed this update, and this has been SDJR 7F88 speaking, and thanks for watching.